Yep, so I think we're live now.
Thank you. Good evening. It's now 6:05 PM. I'd like to start the meeting of the Lower Thames Crossing Task Force. Apologies for the slight delay. We're just getting everyone into the right online meeting rooms. The purpose of the task force is to discuss and make recommendations in relation to environmental, economic and social aspects of the Lower Thames Crossing, the LTC. I'd like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be recorded and live streamed to the Council's webcast website. And I'd also like to remind members and officers to please mute their microphones when not speaking. Moving on to apologies for absence. Lucy, could you run down if you had any apologies for absence, please?
Yeah, we've had apologies from Councillor Jeffries, Wesley Mercer, the Thurrock Business Board rep, and Anna Eastgate, the Assistant Director LTC.
Thank you. I also heard from Councillor Spilney, who said he's running a little bit late, but plans to join us. I'll move on to the minutes and minutes of the last meeting. Has anyone got any comments on the accuracy of the minutes?
Agreed.
Thank you, Councillor. So I move that the minutes of the Lower Thames Crossing Task Force meeting on the held on the 15th of February 2021 be approved as a correct record.
Yes. Agreed.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Thank you very much. Moving on to agenda item 3, urgent items of business. I have not agreed to any urgent items of business this evening. Moving on to declarations of interest. Does anyone with declare a declaration of interest? Can't see any hands raised. Lucy, just to double check.
No, no hands raised.
Thank you all. Moving on to agenda item 5. This is going to be the environmental impact assessment update. Chris Strafford's going to be presenting this, and then be time for members to ask questions afterwards. Chris, will you present your report?
Sure, thank you. I hope you've all had time to receive it and read it. I wasn't proposing to go through it in any detail, given that there has been time to read it, but I will outline some of the main points. So the paper's structured into 4 bits. First of all, what stakeholder engagement have we had? And this is technical engagement largely. Then what were the council's concerns in summary? And then what are the current outstanding council concerns, and then what happens next? So those are the 4 stages. And I should point out that we are only part way through a process. So this is just an update. It's far from a conclusion. So at this point in time, you would expect there to be outstanding issues, and there certainly are. So in the table on the front page, it points out that we have received back last year, ranging from January last year right up to July and August last year, a range of technical documents. And the most substantial of those were draft environmental statement chapters. And there were, I think, 12 chapters in all. We then responded to all those different technical documents during October, and the Lower Thames Crossing then came back to us with their comments on our comments on the 3rd of February this year. So we're still digesting those comments, which means that not only do we have to do that, we also then have to review what's now called DCO version 1, which is the short version that you'll see in the report, DCO V1. So on the second page is a fairly colourful table setting out down the left-hand side the various 12 topics. I think there's 12, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 11 topics that is normally part of most EIAs. That's the environmental impact assessments. And then across the top axis, the various stages of how it's reported. And first of all, you look at the policy, you then look at the assessment methodology and what the current circumstances are for each of those topics, how the project is designed, and what mitigation could be used. You then assess the impacts the project's done and the cumulative impacts, and then you do subsequent monitoring. And the colour coding there is called RAG, which is red, amber, green, no more. Obviously the green means that it's okay. We're happy with it. Amber is okay. There's some things to deal with, but it's not critical. And the red is obviously something that they must deal with before the DCO, in our view. And the purple is something they really do need to deal with very quickly. And you can see that the majority, just getting a sense from it, the majority of the colour there is amber. So, but there are quite a lot of red and purples. And it's the red and purple matters that I've then gone on to summarise afterwards in section 4 of the report. Now, as I said, that's the issues as they were back in October. We're still now assessing what response Lower Thames Crossing have made on each of those issues to see whether we agree with them or whether further works and discussions need to happen. And then the rest of the paper, through a series of subheadings, for instance, we just take air quality for one. There are 4 key issues that we feel need resolving. One is they've decided that barges and what's called non-mobile machinery, which is all the construction stuff on the various construction sites, the emissions from those shouldn't be considered, and we don't agree with that. Similarly, we don't understand what particular mitigation could be applied to some of that construction plant and equipment, and we need to have further discussions about that. And then there's the one you'll be familiar with. They are doing an assessment of PM10, and by virtue of that, they include PM2.5, which is the very fine particles. But we're suggesting that actually they should measure 2.5 directly and monitor it. And then there's a catch-all that you'll see in most of the subheadings, most of the topics, which is the assessment of impacts and mitigation. Because we haven't yet had time to assess their responses, we're not clear yet whether their assessment of impacts is right and consequently whether they put in sufficient mitigation. Our sense is that there's probably a gap, but we don't know that for sure yet. Then moving on to cultural heritage, there was a very, very large document called the DEST-based assessment, which is exactly what it says it is. It's a full assessment of all the cultural heritage. That's all the scheduled monuments, all the listed buildings, the registered parks and gardens, and the local listings. And the methodology from that is been called into question by not only ourselves but other authorities and Historic England, and that is in the course of being redone. There's some incomplete archaeological survey work around the portal, which we've raised with them, and again the whole way they've dealt with impacts and how they're mitigated is an issue. They have pointed out in landscape and visual that they have put in what they consider to be adequate landscape mitigation. We're still in the process of assessing that, and we don't know. Similarly, terrestrial biodiversity, we're not entirely certain that what they're proposing is adequate, and we are in the process of formulating new ideas for them to consider for both green infrastructure and, for that matter, public rights of way that they might not have included in the scope of the LTC already, and indeed contributions to the wider area. Steve Plum, who's on the line, has prepared a paper about the Tilbury through to Coalhouse Fort and up to Stamford La Hope. It's a sort of boomerang shape, and that particular wider area is a very important area because it contains 4 scheduled monuments and a whole raft of environmental assets, and it would be a very, very critical area to ensure that it's up to a relevant standard, given the intentions in the future for growth within the council area, because it's an area for people to recreate and enjoy generally. So LTC maintain that they've got 15% biodiversity net gain. We're not sure how that's achieved yet or how it's secured even. So we'll be questioning on that. The issue about materials and waste, they are now producing a number of additional documents to the ones that they included in the DCO version 1. So there is now a site waste management plan, which we're currently reviewing, and we're reviewing the targets and how they're secured for what they do with the waste. There's a big link, in fact, between waste, the construction traffic assessment, and the navigation, because obviously, clearly using the river for either transport of waste or materials is preferred, because it can be a huge saving on traffic and congestion and trouble on the local roads. Noise and vibration. We know they put quite a lot of noise barriers up. We don't know the details of those yet. We know their heights, but we don't know the details. And they may be required to have further locations. Population and human health is a companion, if you like, to the health and equalities impact assessment. And we have a number of queries about the transparency of what is called CPAG, which is the Community Impacts Public Health Advisory Group. It met for 2 years. I think there were 9 meetings, and it provided some information to a range of local authorities and their health departments. And it's likely that that may well be reformed, and I'll deal with that more with the health impacts paper. The economic benefit to the local council, obviously we're questioning that. The council has now publicly released the full hatch mitigation report, which is about 120 pages, along with a non-technical summary. It's on the council website now, and we're recommending 57 measures, and we're getting very positive indications that probably at least 2/3 of those are likely to be implemented in advance of the DCO being submitted. We've got to check how they're implemented and how they're dealt with in detail, because the devil's always in the detail, but it's a positive matter. Employment and skills is going well, I think. There's a lot of discussion between the skills that the project needs and the skills that the council has or wants to employ, and the various departments in the council are having, as I say, positive discussions about that. The whole issue of impacts and mitigation is tied into the health and equalities impact assessment, so I'll leave that for that one if you don't mind. Road drainage and the water environment, we are being advised by Essex County Council on this one, and I believe things are moving in a quite a positive direction. We've got meetings next week to find out exactly whether the issues have been all dealt with. And the cumulative assessment, and this cumulative assessment is an odd one within a environmental impact assessment, because up to a certain point, all confirmed developments in a reasonable vicinity need to be considered within the impacts that this particular project might cause. So in other words, what happens if there are 15 other projects going on all at the same time? How do we assess that? And there are quite strict rules about that. It's not just, you can't consider planning applications, but you should consider granted DCOs, you should consider granted planning permissions, and there are certain other provisions that need to be built in. And given the delay in the resubmission, the date for the cumulative effects cutoff is obviously going to be extended. So there's quite a lot of work to be done over the next few months, and we'll be having many meetings about it. I think that's probably enough, so I'll leave it for questions. Councillor Massey.
Thank you, Chris. Yes, it's clear there's been a lot of work. Well, someone speak their mic, please. It's clear there's been a lot of work going into it. I know it's a lot of work to go forward with. I think you're absolutely right to push on the non-road mobile machinery, the barges. Because at a time I saw in the press, I think the result we're talking about maybe using cruise ships that in Tilbury to house construction workers. So, and if they're going to be running on diesel and things like that, then there's obviously going to be a lot more up in the air than there is at the moment. And with that, I'm going to go over to Councillor Rice. I think he had his hand up first.
Thank you, Chair. Chris, when it comes to landscape and visual, obviously we're looking at trees. And last month, shall we say, their presentation, Highways England, they talked about trees very glibly. We've really got to push them on having mature trees, because if we go for these, well, which virtually would be, you know, these small whips, they're going to take forever to grow. So, and there'll be no protection. And you do mention in your notes about Tilbury, the Chadwell link, the Mardyke Valley, the Ockington link, and around the A13 and M25 junctions. If we're only going to have, you know, these very small tree implants, they'll be next to useless. We do need mature trees, and if it has to cost them money, Chris, well, that's too bad, if you understand where I'm coming from.
Whilst Chris is muted, Councillor, it's probably.
Sorry, Steve, I'm back now. I was just, I have no sound at the back here, so I'm fine to leave it unmuted. Yeah, just a point about the trees. First of all, the types of landscape vary, obviously, because there's open landscape, there's wetland landscape, and there's woodland landscape, and there's probably many others as well. So it's not all hinging around trees. Usually, there are various types of trees that you could plant, but you're right, whips is at the lower end, but then there are standards and tall standards, semi-mature. It's very, very unusual to plant mature trees unless there's a particular specimen tree that you want for a particular reason. Now, I know they did that in the Docklands many, many years ago when they had loads of money, but they are extremely expensive and they fail very easily. So we have to be a little bit careful about the standards. But we are pushing them further on this, and I know Steve is heavily involved. So I'll step back now. Let Steve go.
Right. Thanks. Yes, it's as Chris was saying, it's very much the sort of it's very wide aspects. You know, the whole landscape and visual impact. We're looking at the ways to mitigate the effects. You know, where the road is positioned and things like that. There's different types of screening. Yes. The issue is, in terms of planting trees, is always this balancing act between size of trees. You've got a range of factors to consider. The larger the tree, as Chris said, the more likely they are to fail. They're also a lot slower at establishing. So once they're planted, they take a long time to actually put enough roots down to put the growth on. So you wouldn't want to plant everything as large sort of standards, because they just take so long to go. But yeah, this is the thing we're having to go through with the mitigation, is where we can use smaller stock, where we might need to use larger stock or a mixture. So this is what the sort of balancing act is, because it's trying to get that, you know, and with climate change, one of the issues, if you're planting moving bigger trees, they actually just take a lot more energy to do so. So there are certain species, some of the nurseries are actually stopping doing now because they're relatively short-lived. So it is a balance, but something we're looking at in detail.
Good. Well, as I say, the main thing is we don't need the whips. The whips are going to be small. They're going to take forever to establish. Whether they're mature or, you know, smaller trees, we leave it with you. But I think where we've got to be, we've got to have a standard which is going to do something within a very quick period of time. It can't be 5 to 10 years, if you know where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and again, it can be sort of species choices. There are obviously species which are faster growing than others, and so again, that's all the sort of the detail we're now getting towards. And that, as we've now got some like the ecological mitigation plans and landscape plans coming through, we can start reviewing those in more detail.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you. Lucy, did you see you had a hand up after Councillor Rice?
It's Councillor Muldowney and then Peter Ward.
Councillor Muldowney.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chris, for your report. So I appreciate there's been a transparency shift, as you say, that now there's a lot more information coming through, and probably the biggest challenge at the moment is digesting that and responding to that, and being able to process tens of thousands of pages of information. But it is good that we're getting it before the next DCO submission, so there's that at least, because certainly in the past we've anticipated that we wouldn't get any of this information until after DCO had been submitted and accepted. So that is good in terms of getting that information up front, but quite a hectic workload for you guys. So thank you very much for all you're doing. Having said that, though, it does feel that things may be moving in the right direction, but there's still nothing confirmed. I mean, even the hatch suggestions, although we feel we're moving towards, we're having good discussions and it's a positive discussion, there's still nothing really confirmed, is there, about any of those measures? So
no, not really. But that's quite normal. The process to get the technical documents into an acceptable state, given that we're not the only stakeholder, there's at least 2 other authorities, plus the 2 county authorities, plus the main statutory stakeholders, the environmental ones, plus a range of others. So it does take a while in order to balance out, one person's view against another person's view and reach an agreement. So it is quite normal. The process didn't properly start until fairly recently, to be fair. So it was still going. I mean, I was part of it, but it didn't open up properly. So now we've got much more open, and you're right, there is a huge volume of material coming through, and we are, there's quite a biggish team behind us that Anna's managed to secure for us through the council, and to a large extent, it's most of the time is paid for by LTC themselves through a planning performance agreement. So there's a large teams trying to do it. So that plus the LTC understanding what each of those 57 measures in the Hatch report really mean. What do we really want? And when you start to drill down, okay, we want some junctions. Well, where are they? What type of junctions? How much space? What do they link to? There's a whole raft of new material that needs to be prepared. So, I mean, I think we're trying to get to a certain point by, I don't know, late spring, early summer, where we do actually reach agreement. And of course, when we do, we would want that then secured in a legal agreement so that we're clear that it's going to happen, So, yeah, you're quite right to highlight the point.
Yeah. So not totally unexpected because of the complexity of the process that
yes,
it has
exactly.
reached that stage.
Exactly.
That's good to understand. Thank you. I've got 2 more things really that I wanted to talk about. First of all, we did have a report on green infrastructure from Highways England last time, but my memory of that conversation is they didn't really look at open spaces and leisure spaces. Now, obviously, we've captured some of that through our hatch proposals. But I wondered, as Steve is here, could he talk us through a little bit more about what is happening about the open spaces? And I'm probably also going to ask him specifically about Chadwell Heath, because, and this is to do with paths and bridleways, because obviously having bridleways is great, but it also doesn't just open up pathways for horses, it also opens up pathways for nuisance motorbikes. And I'm just wondering, what is there in our agreements with what we're going forward with in terms of Highways England for stopping these kind of issues that plague us anyway getting any worse? What kind of mitigation can be put in place that will allow horses to use bridleways but will stop nuisance motorbike and quad bike riders? Wondered if you could say a bit more about that, Steve, please.
Right, okay, there's quite a lot to cover in there. Chris mentioned a piece of work I was looking where we were looking at sort of the area around Coalhouse Fort and how it links to other sites. And again, that's part of that is looking at open space. I have just sent Chris something today, which is looking at some of the other open spaces and more strategic open spaces, and which include parks within it. But because we're trying to look at sort of some the big asks, as it were, where around the borough, so it's more evenly spread, and to start pulling all of these elements together. One of the issues we have is, as with the ES, we have a lot of subjects. So we have ecology, we have landscape, we have people, in all sort of listed separately, and the NMUs, the non-motorised users, all get, and it's all sort of in separate strands. And one of the things we're trying to do with the green and blue infrastructure is to start sort of linking them together, working across different teams within the council, but also externally as well, to try and sort of sort of flesh up some of the ideas which have been in the Hatch report, and looking at opportunities for getting some of these progressed. The issue in terms of who managing rights of way. I was for about 14 years. I was in effect the rights of way manager for Brentwood when it was had the highways agency for county. So it's I've got a lot of experience of managing rights of way, and the issue is always trying to make them as open as possible for the right users, and how you prevent the unauthorized users. And there are a range of sort of barriers and structures and things which can be put in, which control, limit the access. None of them are foolproof, because if you're going to allow people in with motorized scooters, for wheelchair accessible access, for example, you can get people in. I've seen people get on a motorbike, pull it right down on one wheel, wheel it through some of these barriers, and off they go. There's nothing. It's foolproof, but part of it is about policing it. The fact that if you've got more legitimate users on there, it does control it. But that if you have the right sort of barriers and the right sort of frequency, people can't get up the speed, and it sort of takes the fun out of it. So it is a problem, and that's one of the things we're going to have to sort of work through. I've been liaising with Paula Watson, her team, and the Rights Way team, to look at some of these things. But it is something we need to work up in detail, because at the moment all we've got are the sort of the indicative lines that. And certainly the highways maintenance team are already starting to ask, right, what surfaces are going to be used, because obviously if there's going to be increased usage, they need to be robust enough. And so we're starting to get into that detail now. Okay,
thank you. My other question is about PM 2.5, so I might actually give other people. No, not you. Sorry, but actually, Steve, I might come back to you. Maybe we could have a conversation offline about particular issues. That would be really useful to get some of your expertise, but probably not for this meeting. Shall I hold it over to the health impact assessment, because it would be
Yes,
fair
that's
and
probably
give
a good
somebody
idea.
else a chance to speak?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Okay.
Thank you, Councillor. That'd be great. Mr. Peter Ward.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Just on, this is one for Chris, really, I think. Just on the impacts of construction, I've touched on this before at previous meetings. We have a unique opportunity to probably take about half this construction traffic off of Thurrock's roads by utilising the CMAT terminal that we're building on Tilbury 2 at the moment. That'll be up and running in Q4 this year, well ahead of Lower Thames Crossing, and as absolutely every facility that's needed to build a road, asphalt, concrete, aggregates coming in. So it'll be utilising the river as well. Just be useful to get some joined up thinking. Obviously, as a business, we're pushing that with Lower Thames Crossing, as you can imagine, but it'd be useful from a council perspective if the council were pushing that as well, because that will have a massive impact on the construction numbers. Bearing in mind, this is going to take several years to build this road and tunnel. Taking that amount of traffic off the road will significantly reduce congestion, and we'll keep it all basically on the same site. We can move it in different types of vehicles then as well. So rather than hundreds and hundreds of HGVs thundering along Thurrock's roads, we can use it in muck moving machines on site straight to the tunnel portal where it can be used immediately. So just sort of bear that in mind when you're talking about mitigation of construction. There's a lot of benefits to business locally by that happening, but there's a significant impact on reducing that construction traffic. And I think we, not only as a business should we be pushing it, I think the council should be pushing this one as well when you talk about mitigation, because the biggest impactor is traffic on the roads.
Okay, yeah. There's several parts to the answer to that. Firstly, the planning inspectorate, when they were commenting on the first DCO version 1, did express some concerns about the fact that they hadn't shared their transport assessment with us, the fact that it wasn't really linking into their navigational assessment or their waste strategy, and they drew those three things together. Now, it's true that when you do an EIA, and particularly a transport assessment for construction traffic, you must assess the worst case. So they will have assessed everything going by HGV, because that's the best way to do it. Because if you could mitigate the worst case, then anything better than that is okay. So don't be frightened by the fact that that's probably what's been done or will be done. We're currently analysing that, the team is. Certainly any form of removal of traffic congestion and safety, because lots of HGVs on the road create a safety issue as well. So I'm right behind you on that. I used to work for Tideway, and they were adamant that they did as much as possible by the river, and they've achieved quite a lot of that. So I would imagine the council, I can't really speak for the council, but I would imagine the council would want to push for more materials, bulk materials particularly, and ways to go by river. Obviously, we can't get too involved in any commercial discussions because you're not the only port, so I wouldn't want to get involved in that. But I would think we're all behind you. So we'll be looking to try and secure particular targets for materials of various types within the DCO, certainly. Does that help you? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not suggesting that the council will get involved in any commercial things. That's not, it's more the case that, there's a realisation there that they basically have on their doorstep what they would have to build or bring in from outside. So why bring it in from outside when it can just be moved from the port, which is next door, which doesn't cut across any public roads whatsoever? It would literally go from our site on a construction haul road straight out to the tunnel portal. And not touching Thurrock's roads at all, which I think is quite significant when it's reducing traffic by 50%. And that's a conservative estimate. Fully understand they've assessed it on a worst case scenario, because that's what you have to do for an EIA. but you know that needs to just be looked at from a mitigation point of view. So not commercially, but there's common sense there that says that should be used. But there's also a huge environmental gain from using it as well, because you've not got all that traffic running around.
The other thing I forgot to mention is that although we're looking currently at their site waste management plan, the one thing we don't yet have, and we're soon to get evidently a draft of a materials handling plan. Now, bear in mind these documents at a reasonably high level, but they will indicate what they're planning to do with all the materials supplies that they need for the tunnel. And of course, the PLA will be pushing LTC very hard to drive more by river, I'm sure, within various navigational risk constraints, obviously, but they'll be adding their voice to yours, I'm sure.
Okay, thanks, Chris.
Thank you, Peter, for your question. Laura Blake.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to Chris and Steve and all the team, Anna, and everyone that is working on all these thousands of pages of documentation. As Councillor Muldowney said, we know how huge it is and how intimidating it must be and how much work and time is going into it, so thank you for that. On the environmental impact assessment update, I'd just like to ask Chris probably, point 12.3 that refers to the estimate of the economic benefits of the LTC. You're listing that at 7 billion. Is that the current figure? Because I have asked Highways England this at previous meetings on various occasions and never had a confirmed answer on that. Is this an official, up-to-date estimate now on the economic benefits for the LTC at 7 billion?
It's not our estimate. I think it's HE's estimate.
Yeah, sorry, that is what I meant. It is their estimate.
I think that, I mean, that may be what they were estimating. Bear in mind the stage that we're at. We haven't yet got to DCO version 1 documents. So I'm not sure if this figure comes from the DCO version 1 or documents preceding that. So I can't really tell you that it's official yet. I suspect it's not yet official.
The reason I ask is that the last information that we can find or official reference we can find is on the government's website in 2017 when the preferred route was announced. And at that time, they said that it would boost the economy by over 8 billion. And back in that time, the actual route was actually between 4.3 billion and 5.9 billion for the cost of the route. Now, obviously, that's gone up to 8.2, but there's mention of 7 billion rather than over 8 billion that they're referencing. So I'm just kind of trying to suss out what that all means and where we're at with it, because HE have avoided answering that question to me when I've asked previously.
Yes, I did mention in italics in that paragraph about the report, combined modelling and appraisal report. I don't know the answer to that question as to what it now is within the DCO. Let me take that one away and check for you, can I?
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you, Laura. Lucy, has anyone else got their hands raised at all?
It's Councillor Allen and then Councillor Shinnick.
Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chair. Just want to touch on a few points first of all, and ask a couple of follow on with asking a couple of questions. With regards to Peter Ward and his business model, utilising the river, and I think it's got its pluses and its minuses, because yes, it does effectively keep road traffic off the roads, but I must add, Chair, that ships are very pollutant. I mean, they burn heavy oil, and they are quite pollutant. So in terms of burning the oil compared to the HGVs, I mean, that's questionable. I can see the pluses and the minuses. Relieving our roads from certain gridlock. But if I can touch on the trees as well, which I think are a very important factor, as Councillor Rice said, and I do believe that juvenile trees actually work harder and filter more than an established tree. But with terms of saplings and whips, they do need constant irrigation to keep them, keep them alive. So there's quite a lot of upkeep. In terms of biodiversity and our invertebrates, creepy crawlies, etc., are Natural England going to be getting involved with terms to biodiversity? So that's one of my questions. And in terms of emissions for the construction of the motorways and the Lower Thames crossing, with plants and equipment, will that a separate impact assessment, Chris, be held for that? And also, you touched on the economic benefit to Thurrock for this, and I think Laura touched on it as well. We know that it's going to be 7 years in for construction completion. We've mentioned 7 billion cost, and also the construction impact and the completion, the general running impact, would be subject to just how many vehicles will use the LTC thereafter. So how do we know? Are Highways England ahead of us in this, predicting, the construction side of things? And once it is built, how many vehicles exactly will use it? Thank you.
Okay. Shall I pick off a few? And I know Steve's chomping at the bit too. You asked about plant and equipment. As part of the EIA process, assumptions, well, first of all, they have to decide how the road will be constructed and what with. So they make assumptions about the methodology for construction, the plant, and all the equipment that's used. And then they make assumptions about each type of equipment, the noise it creates, the air quality issues it might create, how it's transported to the site. All of that is built in as a worst case assumption. So a simple answer to your question is plant and equipment included is yes. And they have to include the worst case. So it'll be worse in the EIA than actually what will happen. And they'll have to mitigate that worst case. In terms of the operational traffic, you're in the realms of traffic modelling then. There's an entire team of traffic modelers within LTC. There are very strict methods that they must follow. And the person that's running that team is actually a world authority in all this. However, traffic modelling is just that. It can't be reality. It has to be the best guess you can make of what might happen. So they assume, using mobile phone data and all sorts of other data sources, how people will use the road, how they'll make their journey, from which origin to which destination, how they'll change their habits, and they come up with a number that's likely to use it. And in the past reports, they show you the effect of those numbers on both local roads and other strategic roads, and on the LTC. So, and it's about as accurate as you can get, because if you scrutinize the methodology for the traffic modelling and you're happy with the methodology, the numbers that come out and the results that come out also need to be satisfied with, and then you decide how you're going to mitigate that, and if you can mitigate that, in fact. So it is built in for sure. That was two of your questions. Steve, you had one, I know.
I had Natural England. Yes, they've certainly been very, very involved. There's a sort of one of their key, the value of Natural England, not only in terms of taking the national view, but also they're the only environmental statutory wildlife organisation which are working on both sides of the river. So they take they're dealing with all of the aspects, and certainly I've been involved with meetings looking at things like the invertebrate mitigation and baselines and things like that. And so they're looking into this in great detail. The other here we've been talking about the environmental statement. There's another major piece of work, which is the habitats regulations assessment, which is looking at the impacts on the internationally designated areas in the Thames. So in terms of the area for Thurrock, it's the marshes, the mud flats between Coalhouse Point up to the Stanford Wharf and start of the London Gateway. But that's only one part of this huge 5,000 odd hectare area in the Thames. So they're working with Highways England on the habitats regulation assessment, because they will inform the planning inspectorate over its impacts. Normally, the local planning authority is what's called the competent authority and has to make that assessment. I'm very pleased to say that's being passed through to the planning inspectors, because that's another huge piece of work, and that it doesn't just look at the Thames, it's looking at the potential of things like air pollution on Epping, the effects on Epping Forest, for example. It's a huge piece of work, and it's one of the areas which I think influenced the withdrawal of the DCO one, because of they weren't satisfied. So it is a big piece of work and they're very, very involved.
Okay, Councillor Allen, I'm sorry, was there any questions that we haven't yet answered? Please let us know.
Thank you both, Steve and Chris. If I could just come back, Chair, with regards to again biodiversity and flood mitigation. Now I understand that certain areas are built that can flood if we have quite bad rain downfalls. Could we not ideally promote like wetland areas like that, which will come into flood mitigation and create extra habitats for the likes of them invertebrates, like the great crested newt, frogs, and so on? Could we not, put into that flood mitigation the promotion of more wetland areas?
It's certainly one of the things we're looking at, because obviously one of the major areas of wetland the main area of wetland creation is within the Mardyke Valley, and one of the things we're sort of looking at is, because it's not only then potentially mitigating the effects of the LTC itself, it's how it affects further downstream as you move towards Purfleet and things like that. So we're looking at that. One of the other areas is in terms of there are balancing ponds and features shown along the length, and at the moment they're all very engineered, sort of perfectly sort of rounded edges and things. One of the things we're pushing for is to make sure that the council has the final say over the actual detailed design, because again I don't want to see is a lot of these very heavily engineered, steep-sided, sort of water-holding features. With a slightly better grades, we can make something which looks attractive, it's good for wildlife, and can feed into the surrounding landscape provision. So that's the sort of thing we're looking at. We are constrained by what's within the red line and what can be considered mitigation, but that whole it feeds into some of the wider work we're looking at with, hence the reason it's gone from being green infrastructure to green and blue infrastructure. It's starting to take in much more emphasis on the the water and what flood risk and how we manage water.
Lovely, thank you both for your response. Thank you.
I think Councillor Shinnick was next.
Oh yeah, thank you, Chair. My question's on the air quality. You've got a couple of sections marked in purple, required and attention. I just wondered how long we've got to wait to hear what's going on regarding this, because this is one of the main factors what's been bounced back and forth since the beginning of the announcement of Lower Thames crossing. And bear in mind, we've got a lot of pollution with the bridge. I just wondered when we're going to get the answers on this. And that's my main concern. Thank you.
Okay, fair enough. The two items that you've got there in purple and the 4 items in red are then summarised over the page in 5.1, 5.2, 3 and 4. And it's going to take some months yet to nail down changes, but the various things that we're trying to make sure is that the monitoring for the various levels of air quality are done properly, and they include barges and non-mobile machinery included in their emission calculations, and particularly their assessment of impacts and the mitigation following from those are adequate. Now, I think Anna has mentioned this on a number of occasions before, but there are certain standards that they need to follow, and if they meet those standards, they don't need to do any more. So we'll be watching that very carefully. And I mean, it is possible for promoters of schemes to do more than required, but we can't insist on it. But there is the fallback position. If we can't negotiate it now before the DCO, it can easily be raised in one of the technical hearings and in all the written representations that we make through the examination. So we've got a few months now to try and resolve all these issues, and then we've got several months during the examination to do just the same again.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think this is something we've got to bring to their attention because it's a major factor in Thurrock, because we've got a lot of COPD, asthma and so forth, and this needs to be brought up, you know, and it's one of the main factors for us in Thurrock, and it's quite disturbing. And also, I fully back what people have been saying regarding the trees. You know, we do need to make sure we get the right trees put in for this project. Thank you.
Okay.
Just while we're on that table, Chris, just so basically looking at the baseline conditions, which are generally amber in the red, amber, green and purple charts. But when we look at where air quality, where project design and mitigation, there's nothing getting any better, is there? Everything's getting worse or staying about the same.
Well, I think there is a sort of unwritten rule that any project shouldn't make anything worse. It used to be called NEWT, not environmentally worse than. It's now got different terminology, but generally speaking, you can't add to the problem with a project. That's the general rule. There's no requirement to make things better, but you can't make it any worse. But then, of course, councils have their own responsibilities for air quality too. Of course, it's not just the promoter of the big schemes. So there's, I mean, the government is trying to change the green agenda, it seems, and there is a proposal within the Hatch report for planting large areas of willow, which act as a cleansing to the air event. Now, whether we get Highways England to actually achieve that, I'm not sure yet, but you're quite right to raise it.
Thank you, Chris. I think Mr. Robert Quick had his hand up next.
Thank you, Chair. If we can just go back to the noise and vibration category, we were all shocked to hear when we first got the information about the construction period, how long the construction day was and for what period of the year it was summer. Is there any enlightenment on that now? And while we're on that, the barriers and false cuttings that they're putting in, just going back to the discussion about getting rid of waste. Now, in their criteria, they've got certain height levels for false cuttings. Can they not just divert that a bit? If they've got extra waste to get rid of, can they not just make the false cuttings a bit higher to use up the waste? And the last thing on noise and vibration from me, these noise barriers. We questioned them before about having absorptive barriers. They were strongly looking at reflective ones. Have we got any more information on that? And will we get any details of how they'll be measured, about their performance, and how we can go back to that?
Okay, right. I share your concern about the working hours and the summer period lasting 9 months. I don't recollect a year in, and I go back a few years when summer's ever lasted 9 months. But it is part of the Hatch report recommendations that we are going to question what it says in what's called the Code of Construction Practice, COCP. They have set out in there what their working hours would like them to be, and they are in the main generally more or less standard. Some of the hours are a little bit early in starting. Summer is certainly very, very long, but it's one of those decisions. I mean, also you've got to measure the noise impacts and the air quality impacts of doing it for longer hours quickly or doing it for less hours over a longer period. It's a bit of a judgment call, and until we actually have the data, it's difficult to know. But we have said to them that in certain areas where the construction work is closer to properties, and generally speaking, that's usually in the Linford and Chadwell areas, I think, you might need to adjust the working hours for those two areas to give people, more time to cope. So those discussions are still ongoing, but we're on the case. The last question you raised, if you can just remind me.
Right, it was first of all about the false cuttings using it.
The false cuttings, yes. Well, there's a landscape concern about that, because obviously the false cuttings are there to protect the road from both view and noise and air quality. And I suppose, yes, Steve might want to comment, but some of these false cuttings could go up in height if they need more material. I mean, it makes sense to get a cut and fill balance. So in other words, everything that they cut, they use as a fill material so that they don't have to transport anything off site, notwithstanding what comes out of the tunnel, obviously. So there needs to be a judgment about the height in the landscape round.
Yeah, so I think that is the issue. It's getting the balance, because the higher the bund goes, in effect, that you have to sort of grade it. There's a bigger land take overall, because unless you want something which goes very steep and it's very steep down, the higher it goes in that way, the harder it is to do things like tree planting, because it dries out much quicker. So there's a sort of balance. Certainly higher could improve, result in better screening. But again, the other issue is that a lot of the material which needs to be disposed of, for example, is coming from the portal, is actually how you get it to. You end up having a lot more vehicle movements, potentially moving the material to where the false cuttings are and things like that. So it needs to be one of those things we need to look at as a whole. But in principle,
the material coming out of the portal, though, is going to be by its very nature quite close to the river. So
yes,
They're intending to use that jetty that's been put up down there to
yeah.
for
But
access.
it's if you're moving material along the route. It's something we need to sort of look at in more detail. But it will have its own sort of visual effects that if you have higher buns, because they can look quite unnatural. Or so it's one of those things we need to sort of balance. But certainly we're considering. There has been sort of discussions at other for along the routes for raising some of the features, but we need to make sure we get those. As I said, there's a lot of different factors to consider.
Right. Okay.
In terms of the noise barriers, you're quite right. They did say that they were going to be reflective and not absorptive. I'm not a noise specialist, and I don't know which one is right, but it will depend entirely on the results of the noise assessment to know whether the reflective ones that they want to put up actually cause a worse problem or not, or whether it's better for an absorptive one. And it's only when we have those results properly that we can tell which is the best method, and then we'll go with whichever seems the best for Thurrock residents.
Okay, I can only go on personal experience of my former life before retirement, where absorptive soundproofing materials was far in excess a better option than reflective.
And I suspect it's more expensive, which may be a consideration by them.
But we don't have to pay for it, they do.
No, we don't. No. We need to pick the right method. You're right.
Thank you.
Okay.
Had nearly an hour on this item. Just Lucy, has anyone else got their hand raised before we wrap up this item?
Councillor Allen has got his hand raised.
Is that an old hand, Councillor Allen, or?
No, thank you, Chair. I'll be quick, I promise. Probably aimed at Chris. With the Lower Thames crossing, I believe having no escort of hazardous goods transportation, such as fuel tankers, would this actually add more of those hazardous goods coming through, which would probably head north on the M25? And with regards to hazardous materials coming through without any escort, would firefighting equipment be incorporated into the tunnel, i.e. sprinkler systems? I know, obviously, if it was a fuel tanker on fire, we couldn't use water, but any kind of foam or dry powder fighting equipment in there. If you could answer that, that'd be fantastic, Chris.
Okay, yeah. Well, funny enough, we're actually having quite a lot of discussions just with Thurrock and Essex, and now the southern authorities as well, with the blue light authorities, that's the fire, police and ambulance, about not only tunnel safety but emergency services provision. And we have asked them all to confirm exactly what their requirements were for things like a fire suppression system. When the tunnel bores go in, how often are there cross passages? Are they, in the Channel Tunnel, they're every 375 metres. Here, they're currently proposed as every 150 metres, and some of the authorities want them to be every 100 metres. I honestly don't know the answer about the hazardous materials. I suspect probably if there's no escort, they probably might use this more than they currently use Dartford Crossing. But we are discussing it with the emergency services, and generally speaking, once the emergency services are very clear what their requirements are, we've then got to have discussions with LTC about how those are legally secured, because right now the drawings that don't even show the intervals for the cross passages, so there's no guarantee that those will be in place. There's no guarantee about a fire suppression system. So we have to go through quite a lot of discussions with the emergency services and then with LTC to make sure that these provisions are made. So you're quite right to raise this. It is a bit of an issue, or it could be.
Thank you for your response, Chris. If you don't mind, as well, Chair, just come back quickly on that very quickly. We should ideally then, Chris, be looking at implementation of perhaps 2 new firefighting stations, one on our side, located in close proximity, and one on the opposite side in close proximity. So if anything did occur, and we all know how dangerous these fuel tankers can be. I mean, I've got my ADR Class 3 flammable liquids certificate, so I've had to sit in a classroom to do that. And we all know how dangerous they are, not only loaded with 56,000 litres of fuel, but they're also quite dangerous empty. So I would seriously be trying to press to get 2 new stations, firefighting stations, located on both sides of the river.
Okay. I mean, I honestly don't know the answer to that question. I have to leave it to the emergency services to tell us what they want, and then for us to negotiate those requirements into the DCO.
Absolutely, but I'd hate to see a tragedy.
Oh yeah, I agree, which is why we're pushing it, and there are lots of meetings planned about this to get it right.
And again, we must take into consideration that it could be targeted for a terror attack as well.
Yeah.
Thank you, Councillor. I think there's lots of points there we could cover off in future meetings, probably have a whole meeting about some of those. We could move on to the next agenda item, which is item 6. Thank you very much, Steve and Chris. Chris, you're not going anywhere just yet, but Steve, thank you very much.
No, I know. Okay. Helen,
just before you before you start, I was about to ask. This would be much easier usually. Is Helen joining us?
Yeah, she's on the call. She's there.
Excellent.
I'll present it if you don't mind. There we are. She's put a camera on. I'll present it, and I think Helen's obviously been through this with me to make sure it's okay as a report, as an update report. But she'll be answering some of the questions you might have on public health. And I'll try and answer some of the others, and ones that we can't answer, we'll take away.
Just for the public, this is the health impacts update. Yes,
this is the health impacts update. So, as with the last one, I'll keep it relatively short. There are three parts to this slightly smaller report. One is where we are in the process. The next one is what are the council's concerns at this point in the process, and lastly, what are the next steps? And it's very, very similar to what I just outlined for the EIA. So we got a working draft of the HEQIA, the Health Equalities Impact Assessment, on the 3rd of August, and we responded with Helen's team on the 1st of October. And it was not until February that we got a response to our response. Now, the team is currently looking at that response to see how adequate it is. And then once it's done that, like I said with the EIA, they then need to look at the HEQIA submitted in the first version of the DCO. So 2 stages to the work. And only at the end of all of that, which we hope to complete, I don't know, in a few weeks' time, we can then begin to have meetings with LTC to go through all the concerns that we've got. Now, that's just from our point of view. Obviously, other authorities are doing much the same. The CPAG group, the Community Impacts Public Health Advisory Group, ran for 9 meetings between November 18 and July 20, and it is likely to start up again. And this time it will be much more transparent. We're still talking to them about, I mean, obviously all the local authorities will be part of it. Public Health England, in whatever form it ends up with, will be part of it. The composition from who chairs it is still in discussion. And at a high level in Highways England, they're going to be involved, so that if we get to a point where a decision is required during these meetings, we'll get clear decision from a high level in HE, in Highways England, which will help us move forward, because we were struggling to do that last time. And then separate from all of that, Helen is in the process of trying to garner the other authorities in the region, such as the two county authorities, Gravesham, Havering, Brentwood, and possibly Southend, to do a separate independent audit of the version 1 DCO Health and Equalities Impact Assessment. So there is quite a lot of things going on right now, and we've got quite a few months left to get through all that and try and get the document and the impacts assessment and the mitigation into an acceptable state. I'm not going to go through too much the detailed comments. Suffice it to say that we've only had this one version, and we've yet to look at their comments and their originally submitted version. So generally speaking, there was a broad concern about elements of how they did the baseline, elements of the methodology, and most definitely the assessment results and how they mitigated. And we are not satisfied as it currently stands with it. So there are clear issues related to accessibility and severance, access to open space and nature, air quality, which everyone brings up, and noise and vibration. And I've mentioned those four in the paper simply because they're the four that crop up the most. They're not the only ones, but they're the ones that crop up the most. So it's intended to have, I think it's about 4 or 5 more CPAG meetings, and the first one won't start until probably the end of the month, maybe, and then we'll start to examine what actually is left outstanding that still remains an issue for the council, and then try and get them to accept and change things for the better. I don't know whether you want to add anything to that, Helen?
No, I think that's a good summary. Thank you, Chris. Okay,
so it's a bit shorter, but then this is one topic, whereas the other ones were 12 topics. There was a previous paper that we submitted back last October to the task force. Just to remind you, we haven't gone over that again. That was a summary of where we were with the 3 consultations that LTC held over the last 2 years. And at that point in October, we really didn't know very much. So I haven't reiterated that report. I've just taken it from that point and moved on. But there's still quite a lot of issues outstanding. So any questions maybe?
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate you being here tonight, Helen. I'm going to go to Councillor Muldowney. I think he's got a hand up first.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Hannah. Yes, it all feels a little bit deja vu, I must say. I mean, when I was reading through this, okay, I understand this is a response to the draft. This is a response to the draft health equalities impact.
Yes, it's the early draft, though, the August draft, not the submitted draft. So yeah. There's the early draft. We responded and they've responded back. So we assess their response to the early draft comments, and then we have to check them off against what they actually submitted last time to see. They may have actually covered off some of the issues we've raised. They may have done. We just don't know yet. So it is a bit of a tortuous process that goes on for some months.
Yeah, I understand that, but the thing is that this should have been an iterative process that was happening with the CPAG meetings.
Yes.
And they basically had 2 years of that and not enough baseline data to actually agree that between us that we could agree on the baseline data that we were going to use even. I mean, as I read through it, it was like even the draft rather than the final that was in the DCO submission was sent without assessment appendices and a number of documents that it relied on.
That's
so
correct.
Missing information. There was lack of clarity about the roles, responsibilities, funding and governance of the health equalities and impact assessment. One of my questions is this the problem that you're describing, that we couldn't get sign off from Highways England about some of this stuff, and that's what was preventing?
Yeah, I'll give an example. I was actually working for LTC at the time, and there were several focus groups running to assess, certain issues, and the stakeholder group, wanted the results of those focus groups, which I thought was perfectly reasonable, but Highways England wouldn't release them.
Right.
But now that Matt Palmer, you've all met Matt Palmer, now that he's involved, he's personally guaranteed that if there's any key decisions, we can go to him, and he will hopefully resolve it. I mean, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, of course, but that's a very big step forward, I think.
Okay, well, we'll see how that pans out. I'm going to reserve my judgment.
Yes, of course.
On that one.
Yeah.
So there was no non-technical or executive summary in the draft health equalities impact assessment. No inclusion of SIPHAG stakeholders in assessment of impacts. Lack of clarity and support for the evidence base. Lack of information. Lack of engagement. Lack of clarity. Lack of detail. Lack of timescales. Lack of parameters. Lack of granularity. This is what I read in the report.
No, you're right. It's true.
Yeah, granularity in anything really. Monitoring, no section for monitoring and evaluation of impacts or details.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, I think from the council's point of view, you've done a good job, and thank you very much, Public Health. By the way, I should say a huge thanks to Public Health for putting together this report with everything that you're having to deal with the COVID situation. We really appreciate you being able to put this together at this point. So very grateful, and we should really say huge thanks to you. Yeah, I don't feel like it's really moved on a lot. I mean, as you say, maybe when you get to looking at the final health equalities and impact assessment that was submitted with the DCO, it might be a different story, but I'm not going to hold my breath on that one. And this for me really is where, we go through all of this, we're going to mitigate this and we're going to mitigate that, and we're going to try and get some benefits out of this scheme. But just looking at air pollution, for example, this is where I feel like, is it possible to really mitigate the health impacts of this scheme? When we do finally know what they're going to be. Just looking at PM 2.5, I went on the DEFRA website today, and they're saying that the biggest impact of particulate air pollution on public health is understood to be from PM 2.5. And that's not even being directly assessed within this health equalities impact assessment. That's really, really worrying, particularly as Councillor Shinnock mentioned earlier, that we've got very high levels of cardiovascular, but also chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. We've got high levels of the kind of underlying conditions that are going to be exacerbated by even short-term rises in these kind of particulate matters, which we can see is going to come from both the construction and the operational stage. So we really are talking about, with exposure to high concentrations of this particulate matter in construction, but also in operation. It's the construction that I'm very worried about. It's going to exacerbate lung and heart conditions significantly. It's going to affect people's quality of life, and it's going to increase deaths and hospital admissions. So this is something that's going to affect our children, the elderly, and those who already have predisposed respiratory and cardiovascular disease, who are known to be more susceptible to this. So this is really key for me, and I'm glad that you're pushing them to really look at the particulate matter 2.5. I understand, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, please, that under the policy that we're going forward at the moment with, they don't have to look at PM 2.5, but given the noises from central government that we need to be moving on the green agenda, I think, you know, we should be making a strong case that we do look at this, because this is going to impact our local residents. And it does seem this particulate matter 2.5 does come from roads mainly, you know, in areas with heavy road traffic are the most important source of this particulate matter. So that's my first point.
Was that a question, Councillor, or not?
Well, it's not really. I suppose it's a summary of what.
Yeah, fair enough.
You know,
yeah.
I mean, if I'm wrong about any of this, then please, please do let me know.
No, you're bang on so far.
Yeah, I'm just frustrated because we're at this point still, and it's great to have this report, and I'm really happy that it's come forward, but we're still no nearer to knowing whether what the health impacts are going to be, and whether they're going to be properly mitigated, even if we do get a decent health equalities and impact assessment. We seem to be hardly down that road at all, even more so than the environmental impact assessment. So that's my first point. It is good news that SIPHAG's going to start up again. I hope that there is going to be greater transparency. I do think that you're pushing on the right areas in terms of the health equality impact assessments. They would, you know, they seem like the right priorities to me. Yeah, it's just, well, I mean, the questions that I've got, I don't think you're going to be able to give me the answers to, because I just want more detail about what are the actual health impacts going to be. And I think the answer at the moment is that we still don't know. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, that is true. I mean, I'll make a couple of comments, unless and afterwards maybe Helen might want to add to it. But certainly the methodology that they apply across the board for all the environmental topics is what's called the DMRB, the Design Manual for Roads and Bridges. And under that, there are various guidance notes that you must follow, and they are trying to follow those. Equally so, as Laura will know, there is the National Policy Statement, which has a whole series of requirements in there. And there is a little bit of friction between the two sometimes. We would maintain, obviously, that you have to follow the NPS. That is the guiding document. It is the policy document. And I'm not sure that either one of them are exactly clear about PM 2.5. And unfortunately, the other comment I was going to make is I'm clearly not an expert, but the council doesn't have any officers right now that can do that. We've checked this out. We do with Instantec, and he is involved. And once he's done this assessment and had these discussions, we're not clear who we actually have to clear it with within the council. So clearly there's a I mean, unfortunately some of the environmental health officers are off sick, so that's the problem. It's not a lack of resource, it's just they're just not available. But we're going to push it because other projects have done it. There are certainly monitoring machinery that can do it. I happen to know that on previous projects they have them by the roadside, and they measure nitrogen dioxide, and they measure PM 2.5 and PM 10. They are more expensive pieces of equipment, but they're available, so it's possible to do it. That's really all. I can't really offer anything else. Helen, do you want to say anything or not?
Yes, if I can come in, and thank you for your comments about the public health team and the support that we've provided. That's been really appreciated. In terms of the comments that's been made around HEQIA and how far it's moved on, the summary that's been provided is based on a working draft we were given during the summer period. And as you've kind of noted, a lot of the information in there was missing or not available. So what I can say is it has moved on a step in that some of that information is now available to us, and we're able to look at it. But we need to spend some time going through that in a bit more detail to understand if it, one, answers some of the questions, but two, whether it raises any further issues for us. So that's the piece of work that we're doing now, is going through the additional information that we've been provided, as well as the final copy of the report.
Thank you, Helen. It's good to know. It's good to know there has been a baby step forward, and I'll be interested to hear the outcomes of your analysis of the new information. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I understand exactly what you mean, Councillor, when you said deja vu when you introduced your summary. Yeah, but we are moving forward, and I know there is more information. It's going to keep growing, isn't it? It's going to be an evolving document. I think Laura Blake was next.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I just want to echo those words that have been said of huge thanks to Helen and the public health team. And we know that you're under a lot of pressure, even more so at the moment with COVID, but with the amount of documentation that's involved in this. So thank you for everyone that's involved for your time and hard work on this. It is very much appreciated, and it is obviously a very important aspect of LTC for members of the public. It will impact everyone, whether they're for or against it, whether they realise it or not. It is going to impact everybody in some way or another on the health aspects of it. I'm convinced of that, regardless of what anybody says. Just touching on the PM 2.5 aspect of it, I would just remind everybody that's watching online and to councillors and everyone involved, please remember that PM 2.5 and the World Health Organization standards on this is something that a lot of organisations, including TCAG, are campaigning for to try and get input into the environmental bill when it is discussed by the government later on in the year. So please do all contact your local MPs and keep pushing for that. It's very important for everyone that we try and get World Health Organization standards on the PM 2.5 enshrined into UK law. And then just Chris, probably a quick question on this new transparency with SIPAG being reformed. Will that be to the extent on the transparency that we as a task force and also as members of the public will have insight into things in any way?
Yeah, I don't see why not. I mean, the councillors generally aren't part of the technical team that form the CPAG, but I know I'm creating a rod for my own back here, but I was expecting that these reports that I've done today would need to be updated in some months' time too. So would that suffice?
Yeah, it would just be good to know moving forward when it is reformed and there is a bit more information about SIPAG reformation, that when the meetings are happening, if there are minutes that we can actually review after, or if it's going to be webcast live, anything along those lines, so that we can actually see this extra transparency that they're declaring and see how things are progressing and what is being discussed, so that we get some kind of insight and hopefully maybe some reassurance on exactly what direction things are moving in.
Okay. Technical meetings tend not to be publicised or recorded or anything like that. I'm more than happy to do an update in some months' time. I mean, we would need to be updating the task force as we go anyway. There might be a bit of a gap through the elections, but by then we might have achieved something. So you never know. I can't imagine technical minutes would be shared because we generally don't do that. But I'm happy to provide an update as I've done today. If
that'd be much appreciated. It was just with the wording of transparency coming about, I wondered how far that transparency would go.
The transparency is of a technical nature, and it's flowing from them to the technical officers, not necessarily putting things on TV. Yeah.
No, thanks for clarifying that. And I think really it was where we've all moved more onto Zoom and team meetings that a lot more things are. I mean, this meeting, for instance, before COVID, we obviously had our meetings the public could attend and it wasn't broadcast live, and now it is. So it was just a question really for some clarity on that. Thank you.
That's okay.
Lucy, could you let me know who had their hand up next, please?
It's Robert Quick and then Councillor Allen.
Robert Quick.
Thank you, Chair. Just a bit of information for my enlightenment. I too struggled with the acronym. So in my investigation to find out what SIPHAG was, I discovered that it's chaired by an independent chairperson. Do we know who this is or who it's going to be for this next phase? And is that role important for the outcome?
Yeah, last time it was chaired by Dr. Karen Lucas from Leeds University. She was quite an authority on this, and I can testify to the fact she gave LTC quite a hard time. I'm not sure if she's involved this time. I don't know what the makeup is going to be. I mean, they haven't actually formed it yet. It's hopefully going to be formed of all the public health officers of all the different authorities, Public Health England, and then it's their decision. It's their meeting, so they decide who's going to chair it.
Oh, well, first
So
bit.
I don't know the answer to your question.
You started off with good news about the last one, and then ended up with
yeah.
the negative side. Yeah.
The key in this, though, I mean, whilst the independent chair might have been quite an important element last time when there was very little technical transparency, if there's going to be lots of technical transparency this time, which is what we're being promised, then the need for an independent chair to chase that down may not be as intense. It's just a comment from me, really. That.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Quick. Councillor Allen.
Thank you, Chair. All right, where do I start? Right, with respiratory, I should say, illness, is clear to say it's quite a big thing in Thurrock. There's a lot of people suffer with lots of things. What we mentioned, COPD, and so on. But with air pollution in the UK, we all know it's a major cause of disease. And we have discussed this before: asthma, lung disease, stroke, heart disease, and it's estimated, I believe, that or attributed to air pollution, it causes around 40,000 premature deaths each year, which is about 8.3% of UK registered deaths, whilst it costs around £40 billion each year. To the likes of the NHS. We're all concerned, obviously, about particulate matter, PM10s, which is the heavier stuff, but obviously PM2.5s, which I do believe can enter your blood system. And there's also the matter of brake dust and dust that comes from tyres. Now, even when we go over to electric, we're still going to have that brake dust, and we're still going to have that tyre dust, which again is, I do believe, is quite harmful, and it all attributes to air pollution. And I mean, you know, we don't yet know how many vehicles are going to be using this Lower Thames crossing, and there's just absolute cause for concern, because this is probably the worst thing that's going to happen to Thurrock for the next 100 years, and we've got no idea what the real impact is going to be, and the cost to life, premature death. There's no actual question, Chair, but there's obviously lots of concerns, and I believe that you all share my concerns with how Thurrock's health is going to be impacted by this road, and not only, well, without health, what have we got? That's the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. I think your comments are noted there. I mean, I've said on public record before, you can't improve an area's health by putting a motorway through the middle of it. I still stand by that, no matter how much mitigation you put in place. I think the other members have expressed the same. Lucy, have we got any other hands up?
No, no more hands raised.
If there's no more questions, thank you very much, Chris, and thank you much, Helen, for everything you're doing for us as well. I'd like to echo the comments from the other members. It's not easy at the moment. You're doing a fantastic job. Thank you.
I'll pass the comments on to the team. Thank you.
Here, thank you so much.
Helen, I've got this CO2 emissions paper coming up. Do you want to hang on? Do you mind? I mean, I don't know if there's any particular questions that might come your way, but you might want to at least listen. It's up to you.
I'll stay back to listen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Just before we move on to agenda item 7, CO2 emissions, Chris, how long do you think you'll need roughly to present?
Oh, not long. I mean, it's a 4-page paper. So I wasn't planning to go into too much detail. People have had a chance to read it. It depends really on the number of questions. It's not a topic that is my specialism, it must be said. So I may not be able to answer too much.
No problem. Okay, no, that's fine. I'll let you begin your report whenever you're ready.
Okay, so the blame comes from Councillor Muldowney for this. You asked the question back in December, and here we are. And I've noted at the beginning of the report what you asked for, a perfectly reasonable question, and it came as a reaction to the Hatch report in the early stages back last year. So what I've done is I've set out the 2 measures from the Hatch report, full document, which is now published on the council's website. What I might do, Councillor Massey and Lucy, is I might send you the link so that when you do the minutes, you can publish it, or publish it on the task force website anyway, so that people can go in there and get it. But there are two particular ones. The Hatch report, if you remember, there's mitigation. There were 23 different mitigation measures. There's 12 council-led support measures, and then there are, I think, about 16 or 17 legacy measures. And the 2 related to CO2 emissions relate to the legacy ones. One is establishing targets for ultra-low emission vehicles on the LTC to improve air quality, and the other one concerns some carbon offsetting of the LTC scheme, largely through willow planting. Now, both of those schemes are in the report, and we're beginning to get reactions to them. And in the second page, it sets out in much more detail what the second measure on willow planting would involve. It actually costs it out as well. So we haven't yet nailed down exactly what their response is going to be to this, but those 2 measures are set out to partly address the CO2 emissions issue. Now, the current response in the DCO version 1 is set out in the climate chapter of the environmental statement, and in what's called the REAC, the Register of Environmental Actions and Commitments, and indeed the Code of Construction Practice. Now, you've heard me go on about how are things legally secured in the DCO. There are certain documents that force Highways England to do things legally. One of them is the DCO order itself. The plans, all the plans, the Register of Environmental Actions and Commitments, and the Code of Construction Practice. All of those are means by which we can legally secure things, in addition to which we can also have legal agreements. So there are certain commitments in the REAC that they have committed to, and we have made comments on that, and hopefully they'll develop them a little further. Now, something that, in regard to government policy, something that Matt Palmer mentioned at the last meeting, I think, no, the first meeting, he talked about the Department of Transport's decarbonising transport plan. Now that is quite a lot of hope on the horizon. They published what was effectively a draft back in March last year, and then they went through a whole consultation process asking for ideas basically from anybody as to what should go in it. And then they plan to publish it, I understand, in the spring. I've heard April, but who knows? So the final version of that, decarbonising transport, should come out next month, if I've got it right. And in it will have a whole load of measures that will affect the LTC and how they deal with things, particularly the first legacy measure I mentioned before about low emission vehicle targets. Then, of course, I thought I wouldn't get away without mentioning the Transport Action Network, so I put it in there that they have one current challenge, which is on the road investment strategy, and they are building up to a challenge on the national policy statement. Now, Laura, I got my information off their website. Laura tells me that the only item on the road investment strategy version 2 that is going forward for challenge is the climate change, because the government didn't agree with impacts on air pollution or on the strategic environmental assessment. So it's just on climate. So those two things are sort of waiting in the wings, but they may take quite a while to come through. In addition, within the DCO, there is a thing called a carbon and energy plan. It's not clear whether that is a document that they have to comply with, but they have actually assessed the carbon emissions in there. It's interesting to note that infrastructure accounts for 53% of all the UK's emissions. So clearly, LTC will need to contribute to, well, how it contributes to the zero carbon goal that the government are actually setting out. So we will be assessing it. They say in one of their documents that there's over 5 million tonnes of carbon created through not only the construction of the project, but also its operational running for some years afterwards, 60 years afterwards. So there's a lot of possibilities on the horizon. They have agreed to certain low carbon materials and operations, reducing the size of some of the assets as much as they can, changing the concrete mix. All of these things are all quite positive steps, and we will be pushing them more and more. And I'm sure when government policy that's currently emerging begins to crystallize through the course of this year, it may well cause LTC to commit to more things. So there's a lot of things in the horizon. We're still discussing two particular measures with LTC, and we're discussing not only their climate chapter, but also their carbon and energy plan and how they're trying to reduce it. And then, of course, the decarbonisation of transport plan may come along and force them to do even more. So it's a slightly rosy picture, but unfortunately nothing concrete just yet. So that's the presentation.
Thank you very much, Chris. Just one date I've picked up on. It says the final transport decarbonisation plan is spring 21. Is there any new date on that, or is that bang up to date in terms of an ETA on that?
I just have heard through the grapevine, various people that we talk to, that it may be April, and I've called that spring to give myself some wiggle room.
No problem. It looks like that's going to be a very interesting document for us to see. Councillor Muldowney, I think you had your hand up first.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chris, for fielding all these reports, even when it isn't necessarily your area of expertise. So,
all right,
really
I've learned quite a lot
that.
in the process.
Yeah. So let's look at the two hatch mitigations. So my first question is, do we have any idea how much measure what L20, what impact that will have in terms of CO2 emissions?
No, not yet. I mean, there's two elements to that. There is the obvious one where they are actually committing to an electrical vehicle strategy, but right now that's just for the transport of workers from transport hubs to site. What would be more interesting to see what the plant and equipment that we were talking about earlier, what type of plant and equipment they use for all the construction. I mean, it's quite likely that I think it's class 6 under the EU rules for HGV vehicles, which are quite clean. I think there's more than likelihood that they'll have to commit to using that type of vehicle, or the contractors will. So there are signs that things will happen, but if they could commit to the majority of plant and equipment being electric and to HGV class 6 through the EU rules, and to all the vehicles transporting workers, and do the willow planting, that's all we've asked them to do. If they did all of that, they would then have to measure the effect. They would want to publicise, I would think, the effect that it would create, because it's a positive step.
So that leads me on to the second one, which can actually, because you've given us some figures there, thanks for that. I did have to shuffle back in my brain because I did take Maths O level about nearly 40 years ago. But I did work out, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but I did get my maths whiz of a son to make sure that I'd calculated it properly, that the offset, the carbon offset of the willow biomass planting times by 3 to go over 66 years, I was generous there, actually only offsets 0.2% of the total CO2 emissions anticipated from the LTC construction and operation for 60 years. So it's exactly the kind of project that I think is great, and would support if it goes ahead. But I think we need to realise that it's very, very minimal in terms of offsetting CO2 emissions, and this is where unfortunately national government seems to be you do wonder if they're serious about tackling climate change, because Boris Johnson seems to be very enamoured of big concrete projects, big headline concrete projects, which have got massive carbon dioxide levels, because of concrete causes a lot of carbon offset needed, and the whole transport policy around roads. If we're going to cut our emissions, how can we keep going with this kind of transport policy? Interesting that you mentioned the coming through government, we've got this draft of, sorry, where was it? It's the
decarbonisation plan. Yeah, it's on page 3.
I mean, I don't really see how we can have both together. It doesn't seem to make sense to me. If we're going to decarbonise transport, why are we building, why is there this emphasis on building big concrete projects like this? I mean, when you look at, even if we were to do things like have better broadband, that could take traffic off the roads, because more people would be able to work from home, particularly now we've had COVID. It just seems a little bit schizophrenic, the government's policy on this.
It's interesting you say that, because I'm just looking at page 7 of the decarbonisation plan draft, and the 6 things that they emphasise that they want to do in this, I mean, it may change, but is accelerating modal shift to public and active transport. That's 1. Decarbonisation of road vehicles is 2. Decarbonising how we get our goods That's the last mile deliveries. Place-based solutions to reducing emissions. UK as a hub for green transport technology and reducing carbon in a global economy. What there isn't there is any reduction of road building.
Yeah.
Which I was a bit surprised about.
But how are you going to actually achieve any of those aims without a reduction in road building?
Well, I know.
It doesn't make sense.
I don't know the answer to the question, and certainly that is presumably the central tenet of the TAN challenge to RIS 2, because there's 28 billion pounds worth of road building in RIS 2, and they're saying, well, how have you measured that against the current climate change and zero carbon targets? So I'd be interested to see how that pans out.
Yeah, I mean, it will. I mean, if I had my cynical hat on, I would say, there's a lot of talking the talk, but is there going to be any walking the walk, in terms of green initiatives and green promises? Because there's lots of big promises as usual, but there doesn't, when you look at the detail, there doesn't seem to be the policy there that's actually going to support those changes to happen.
No.
But I hope I'm wrong, and I hope that it is just an inconsistency which will be rectified to our benefit in terms of not having the LTC at all.
I don't know whether it ties into CO2 emissions, but I know we're currently as a team trying to push for more consideration of future travel patterns and future technology changes. So yes, of course, buses can use the tunnel. Of course they can. But what happens at either end? They have to go all around the houses in order to get to a point that people can catch a bus. So what are they doing to promote it, for instance? Are they doing anything to promote electrical vehicles in the future? I mean, that is a big, wider government thing. It's not LTC's problem, but there's a lot of consideration about what will happen to travel patterns in the future, because we're all not going to be going to work 5 days a week anymore, are we?
It does seem likely, and it also seems, I mean, if you look at younger people's travel patterns, they're much less likely to be using cars.
Yeah, maybe.
For a variety of reasons.
Yeah. So,
I think that's a really good point. I think you're pushing on all the right points.
Okay.
I hope that this dual process approach by national government will be resolved in our favour. Maybe we might be able to stop the LTC, but in the meantime, we have to go forward in this way, I guess. So it's good to see that these challenges are coming and that the government even seems to be challenging itself.
Good. Yep.
Let me just see what other question I have.
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. Councillor, shall I go over to Laura then, if you've found your question, come back to you?
Yeah, that's fine, thanks.
Laura Blake, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, Chris, for the report. Couple of questions that I will try and get in tonight, if that's okay, and probably more to follow in writing once I've had a chance to review the full 118 pages. And can I just say on that 118, the final Hatch report, I've noticed online when I found that in the last couple of days, there's some glitches in there, Chris, with some text overlapping and some of the text in boxes that doesn't seem to be visible towards the end of sentences. I wonder if that could be reviewed so that we can have an easier read rather than trying to work out what the two merged words are. Don't know if,
okay.
I think.
Yeah, I mean, it was uploaded by the communications team. I can go back to them and find out. I mean, you should be able to download a PDF directly without any glitches in it. Okay, let me check that. Perhaps we can leave that as an action in the minutes, Lucy.
Yeah, because I've asked a couple of other people and they said that they are having a similar issue. So I don't think it's specific to the way I've downloaded it or anything. They seem to be words that overlap over each other, so you have to really struggle to work out what they are.
Okay, yep, I'll check.
Thank you.
So that was an action.
And then just Yep, thanks, Lucy. And then just the two main issues really that I'd like to raise is L21, the carbon offsetting with this willow planting.
Yeah.
This final hatch report is the first we've obviously seen of that. For whatever reason, it wasn't in the executive summary that we've been working on up until this point. So that drew my attention straight to it to actually review that and see something different in there. I'm interested to know, it says Buckingham Hill area. I'm interested to know what the location is, where any biomass fuel that is going to be grown on this willow plantation is going to be used, where it will need to get to, and how, if you can explain to me how this is helpful with regard to carbon offsetting for the LTC, because my understanding is that yes, you plant the trees, the willows, and that's great, that's taking in some of the carbon, but when you cut them and then you then burn them, it's being released back into the atmosphere. On top of that, I would assume that there's some kind of processing needs to happen for the wood to be dried and made into pellets, or however this biomass fuel works, and transporting it between locations. So I'm a little bit of a loss on that one as to how that exactly is meant to be beneficial. And also in 1.3, moving on from that, it refers to the need to restore the potential site for planting, and that potentially spoil from the LTC tunnels could be used for that purpose, but then goes on to state that planting could begin this year. So I'm a little bit of a loss when there's not going to be any spoil. And if you're saying the spoil is to be used to restore the site, but planting is going to start this year, doesn't quite add up. So I wonder if you could clarify any of that as my first point.
Well, they were all extremely good questions, to which I have absolutely no idea. I'm sorry, but I will find out, because when the report was done, various members of the council officers were asked for their opinion about what to include, and this would have come from a council source. I just don't know what the source is, or any details behind it. I'll try and find out for you. When you do write it, could you include those questions in there, please, and then I'll try and do it properly.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I just don't know the answer to. I mean, this particular one has an awful lot of detail. Not all of them have this level of detail, but where it came from, I don't know.
Chris, I can provide a very sort of broad outline. It's a site I know, but it's not a scheme I promoted. It's
Excellent.
the area behind the civic amenities site. There's a large, it's about 26 hectare landfill site which was poorly restored in the past. I've been looking at it as a potential site for restoration, because it's got a very thin layer of spoil on the top. The willow planting scheme wasn't one I'm aware of. I wasn't involved with that. I think that came through, so I'm not quite sure where that one came from. But that's the site it came. They were looking at.
Thank you, Steve. And yeah, I'll put that in writing to you, Chris.
Thanks.
And then the other point, if I can jump in on that as well, just in relation to the decarbonisation plan, which obviously is an unknown quantity until they do make the announcement on that. Have HE got any obligations to incorporating sort of non-motorised users, facilities, actually into the LTC design? The reason I ask is because obviously it's now being stated and referred to that it is going to be an A road. It's an all-purpose trunk road, although it's built to smart motorway standards, and it will have motorway restrictions actually using it. So therefore, we're always told that cyclists and things can't use it in a similar way to the crossing at Dartford. However, when you actually look at it, I actually realised the other day when I was talking to someone about this, if you got onto the LTC, technically at the A13, and you headed northbound, that's an A road. You could then, when you got to the top, be on the new parallel road, which would be an A road, not a motorway, connecting to the A127. So that is a non-motorway route that could be used on the LTC, but without any provision for NMUs. Because my understanding is that, you know, with the crossing as it is at Dartford, cyclists can use that because of it being an A road and because they've got that service to get them across for free. But that particular section doesn't touch motorway at all. So I'm wondering what their obligations are and whether that is something that has been overlooked.
I don't know, but they will be set out in the DMRB that I mentioned earlier. I struggle with the and we're struggling as a team with it, but is it a motorway? Is it an expressway? Is it an all-purpose trunk road? I don't know which one is true. It's certainly an all-purpose trunk road, and it's the A122. But what does that mean? Does that mean that various vehicles are restricted or not restricted? We don't actually know, and we're trying. We've recently done a huge exercise in trying to pull together all of our comments about anything that they've written about transport, and that is one of them. So you're right to raise it, but I don't know the answer yet.
When we've always asked consultations and things previously about whether or not they were going to put facility, for example, for cyclists with a free crossing in a similar vein to Dartford, the reason we were told once they stopped calling it a motorway and referred to it as an all-purpose trunk was that because it connected the M2 and the M25 and there were no options to get on and off that weren't going to incorporate a motorway, that was their excuse for not having that facility on there. But then I have come to the conclusion now that, as I say, with that, even just with that one particular route, you could get on at the A13 and go to the 127 without touching technically a motorway. And it also concerns me with the aspect, as we touched on, I think it was last month, with the public rights of way that are being incorporated, that some of these that Highways England are listing as new are actually adequate existing footpaths and cycleways. And I'm just wondering if there is a box that needs to be ticked for them and the project to satisfy NMUs, non-motorised users, and they're kind of using it in their own way to avoid doing it what I would call properly, and just to try and tick boxes by making things look better than the reality. And I wondered if that's something that we could maybe touch on and look into a bit further.
Yeah, I mean, we have now got a report that LTC did a while ago now, assessing all the existing, they're now called WCRs. I think WCRs.
Cyclists and horse riders, is it?
WCHs, you're right, yes. Previously, they were called pedestrians, cyclists and equestrians, so it's a bit difficult to keep up. So there's 3 acronyms, great fun. Yeah, so they did this report which looked at all the NMUs, let's call them that, in the area, and I mean the whole area, what condition they were in, what missing links there were any needing upgraded, and they took the sort of top ones that would have, the biggest bang for the buck type ones, and they incorporated them into the scope of the LTC, and that's what Claire Donnelly was talking about last time. What we're doing, and what Steve will eventually get to, is a review of that report, and then try and add into the scope of the LTC additional links and additional provision where they've missed out certain areas or where we could benefit from other areas. So in addition to adding a whole range of green and blue infrastructure projects, we're also and open spaces, and all the ones that Councillor Muldowney mentioned are now in there in the full report, which I'm sure you've noticed. We're trying to do that as well, so that we increase the provision for Thurrock residents, because as Claire pointed out last time, there is a lot of capability in the younger population, obviously younger-ish population, but not necessarily the provision to encourage it. So we're trying to add to what they're already doing by doing more, and that needs a bit of detailed work that Steve's got on his list of things to do after he's reviewed all the DCO documents.
I will go to sleep one day.
But yeah, you're right. I mean, we are going to push them for that, and I think it's an easy win for them, and they can sort of demonstrate how they're listening, and it doesn't cost that much. So these things could be quite a positive improvement.
I'd just like to see some more improvements. I think they're trying to tick boxes and take an easy route out. Things like that footpath and cycle route along the old A13 that they're declaring as a new route, when clearly there's a perfectly adequate route as far as most people that I've spoken to can see along there already. There's also the aspect that there isn't really anything built into the LTC as such for NMUs, And even taking the buses into account, there's not really, what I can see and from talking to people, a viable bus route because of the fact of the lack of adequate connections. So you're really looking at them putting it in. We're talking about, as we were saying, you were saying before, decarbonisation plans, which don't match up to that because you're putting in this whacking great big road, whether you call it a motorway or an all-purpose trunk road, that doesn't offer any facility for anyone other than the HGVs and the cars. It doesn't even include buses. So it's not helping people with that barrier of the river and the connections for people locally and nationally to connect. You know, we all know that if you want to get across there on a train, you've got to go into London and then come back out. The ferry, we're lucky to have that option, but it's limited because of weather and as such on that aspect. So I think it's something that needs to be pushed more if this is to go ahead. Obviously, I am still fighting it and will do everything I can to fight it. But as we've always said, two-pronged approach of getting the best worst case scenario if the worst does happen. And I think that this is something that so far from what I'm seeing, HE are not ticking any boxes. They're just wriggling around and trying to tick boxes to make themselves look better than it really should be.
Fair enough. Thank you.
Just before we move on, members, I think we've got a couple of items left. One's a verbal update, the other's the work programme. We shouldn't need too much time, but I'd like to move a motion without notice to suspend Council Procedure Rule 11.1 to allow the meeting to continue beyond the time limit.
Agreed.
Anyone second that?
I'll second.
Thank you very much, Councillor. Thank you.
Agreed.
Okay, have you got any hands up, please, Lucy?
No, there are no more hands raised.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Chris and Steve, for that. I think this, again, it's going to be something that's going to come back before, not in the not too distant future. But thank you very much, Councillor Muldowney, for championing that.
Okay. I just one thing, if I can add, Councillor Massey. I saw Gerald, Councillor Rice there. We are looking into your email, Councillor, about Northwood project. So just to let you know that that's happening. It's a small project, but we'll add it to the list. Thank you. Did you hear me, Councillor Rice? Yes. Oh, good. Thank you.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Chris.
No problem. Thanks.
Thank you, Chris. And item agenda number 8. Chris, it's yourself again. Nearly there. This is a verbal report on the mitigation update.
It's a very short one. We have now received a written communication from Highways England on each of the 57 items, and all I can say at this point is that we're looking at it. Obviously, before we can do anything in the public domain, it's got to be gone through with officers and senior members, and then when we've got something, which might be April, we'll try and bring it back. I can't really offer any more than that. I mean, it is quite, it's more, if you remember when they said they were looking at, I think it was 27 items, it's gone up from there, but the detail is they say that they're covering it and doing it, but then you've got to look into the detail of it. How is it being done? When is it being done? How is it secured? These are all the detailed points that we have to discuss with them. And that discussion is likely to last a few more months. So I think Matt Palmer has said that he would like to try and get to a reasonable sort of handshake, if you like, by May, June. So there's a few months left and lots more meetings. So I can't say any more than that at this point.
Thank you, Chris. Has any member got their hand raised, Lucy?
No, there are no hands raised.
So, Chris, you'd say within the next 1 or 2 meetings of task force, there'll be a bit more to discuss.
Yeah, I would hope so. I mean, it's not my decision to release the information. It's people above me and around me that have to make that decision. So, but as soon as that decision is made and we've gone through the processes, then yes. When's the first meeting of the task force after the elections? Is it June or July? June. Okay.
Brilliant. One to look out for coming back to us then. Thank you. Just before we move on to item agenda 9, the work programme, I just wanted to put on record my personal thanks for a lot of the officers and the work they've done throughout this year, and especially for Miss Anna Eastgate, who I think has done an amazing job and got us a lot further forward with Highways England, and the information and the style that she's brought to the role has been really appreciated by myself, and I'm sure other members would feel the same. If they wanted just to say anything on record, I think now would be a good time to do that.
Yeah,
Laura Blake.
Yeah, I back that up 100%. Thank you very much to all the team, and in particular with Anna moving on. I'm not sure whether we're having the April meeting or not. Just like to say big thank you to Anna Eastgate for all of her time and work, not only to Task Force, but to us as an action group. I've learned so much from her over the years, and she has been such a big help to us. So thank you very much from everybody at Thames Crossing Action Group, Anna, for all of the time and help if you're watching this ever. Thank you.
Councillor Muldowney.
Yes, I'd just like to echo those words. Obviously, Anna's moving on very soon. We think April, so even if we have an April meeting, she won't be here. But also to the whole team, really. And thank you especially tonight to Chris for fielding all of these reports, and to Steve for coming here and supporting, and Helen as well. Sorry, I called you Hannah earlier. Helen from the public health team. We do appreciate the incredible amount of information that you're having to go through and answer and respond to, and then summarise and bring to us in some kind of understandable way. So thanks to all for all your hard work. Hope we can have a meeting in April.
Councillor Spillman.
Bear with me, sorry about that. Yeah, just to echo, the sentiment for Anna. She's, she brings a huge amount of knowledge, absolutely no nonsense, straight to the point. There's no fluff with Anna. She tells you how it is, but also she's thoroughly entertaining as well. So, which is a point about Anna, which we mustn't ignore just how entertaining she's been over during her time since Thurrock. She's never. I've always made me laugh in every committee she's always been in, and some of the best facial expressions you'll ever see in any committee anywhere. So, all the best to Anna. I'm sure she'll do a wonderful job like she's done here, and I'm sure she's got a great career ahead of her, because she's been a real plus for us during this process.
Councillor, could I offer my thoughts as well? Would you mind?
No, go ahead. That's fine.
Well, I mean, other than her choosing to bring me on board was unusual and good for me. But you've got to understand that Anna spots problems long before they happen. The Hatch report was started like almost 2 years ago. First of all, in its economic cost, and now its mitigation. To think that through and get that engaged took prescience. It took, thought. Also, she was the first authority to get the planning performance agreement, so that many of the resources that are now being spent, my time, Helen's time, Steve's time, and others, is paid for by LTC under a certain arrangement. So all of that she was the first one to organise that. So she got Stantec involved well before that was even happening. So she thinks things through well in advance, and now we're benefiting from everything. So and I found her particularly entertaining too. I have conversations with her several times a day usually, and they're always fun. And you shouldn't lose sight of all that amongst all this professional stuff. So I've enjoyed working with her too. So please note that in the minutes.
Thank you, everyone. Any hands raised, Lucy?
No more hands raised.
Okay, so thank you very much, Anna, and good luck in the future. Thank you. We're going to move on to the work programme, which is included on page 37 to 40 of the agenda. Does any member have any further items they would like to be added?
Before anyone answers that, I did circulate to Lucy the formal response from LTC by letter to all the questions that were raised in the January. It's a 5-page letter signed by Matt Palmer. I don't know that it needs discussion, but it's there.
Thank you for that, Chris. Yes, Laura, becomes our hand up. Laura Blake.
Thank you. Yeah, just in response to Chris's comments on that, probably won't surprise you that I do have some comments and questions to follow up on that, along with the questions that I submitted in January through Task Force that I had responses from Highways England. There are some further questions that I have on that, so I'll submit those in writing if I may. Thank you.
Okay, I mean, there's two parts to that. There's the questions you mentioned to me earlier, Laura, and then the questions that you might have of LTC need to go through the chair, as you know, and then we can ask them for their responses to those questions.
Thank you.
It may not be us that answers them, it's probably them.
Yeah, thank you.
I don't think there's any hands up, Lucy. I can see any on your screen. No, none at the moment. Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. You've been brilliant tonight, taking all the reports, and thank you, Steve and Helen. Oh, Councillor John Allen, just at the last minute there, John. Have you got one brief question?
Thank you, Chair. No question, but I'd just like to thank everyone, Chair, for their contribution to the task force, including our Lucy. Thank you, Lucy. And I can only hope that we can further influence the likes of Highways England, so we can, you know, get the best deal out of this, because I know it's going to be pushed on us, Chair. You know, and I remain completely opposed to it, and my sentiment is that it is going to drive a stake through the beating heart of Thurrock, which is a sad thing, a real sad thing. But thank you all for your contribution. It's much appreciated.
Thank you, Councillor. Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. It's really this committee brings out some really good ideas. We do a lot of debate. They're not always the shortest meetings, but I think it's important work that we're doing, and we'll be taking that forward. So this concludes the business of the meeting this evening. I now declare the meeting closed at 8:22 p.m. As always, thank you very much.
Yes, well done.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Yes, thanks all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.